My name is Ilan Stavans, and I am here to first welcome all of you to this, which promises to be a very insightful, provocative, and eye-opening day on language crossing, language departing, and switching self, switching identities, living lives in multiple tongues. This is mainly an effort by Natasha, Lvovich, and Steve Kellman, who have tirelessly been working the world over, trying to go beyond geographic and national borders when understanding literature and appreciating it from the perspective of language. It is a delight for Amherst College to be able to do this here and to have them both. I just want to give 2 or 3 words of introduction to give you a sense of where we are. This is the Alumni House. It's a beautiful building, an old building here at Amherst College, a small but vibrant college in a consortium, the 5 college consortium, and we have guests here from the different colleges. Exit door to, you used it to come in. The bathrooms, men and women downstairs. I want to thank a number of, first of all, a number of sponsors. We have a couple of sponsors from the college that have been involved. They are the Lursi Fund and the Eastman Fund that made possible the day here today. We also want to thank National Public Radio that is taping the proceedings, particularly during the morning, and parts of which are going to air on the station later on this month. And I want to thank particularly, from the bottom of my heart, Joan Lawrence, who is the administrative assistant in European Studies and in German, and a very good friend who has done everything to make us all feel very comfortable today. And she has done it kind of quietly and so professionally and efficiently. And Joan, thank you so much. I already thank you before, but now publicly in Spanish, gracias, in Hebrew, toda rava, in English, thank you. I forget which languages to say. Just muchas gracias. And now I will let Natasha to come in and do this official.
Hey. Hello, everyone. It's a wonderful day, and I would say sort of a dream coming true for many of us in this room. Thanks so much to Ilan Stavans for helping us organize this, for giving us a space, and his energies and the wonderful assistants whom we will continue thanking. So just a word very briefly about what this gathering is about. It is a dream come true because only 5 years ago we were all diffused in various places in the academian labyrinth, and we formed a professional community. So many of us know each other, and the beauty of it is, and that was the main point on my agenda, was to unite various disciplines and people who work in a variety of fields related to multilingualism and comparative literature, post-colonial studies, and various Slavic and Spanish and and German and other combinations of multilingual repertoires. So the idea is that since multilingual and translingual literature, as we call it, has been growing exponentially, its study has been growing as well. And to reflect that, I think, it's been important to put together people scholars and writers from a variety of fields and genres and styles and methodologies. So I'm so glad that it's happening. We've had quite a few seminars at various international conferences and at the Comparative Literature Conference and Bilingualism Symposium, trying to embrace all those connecting and not dividing fields with scholars from all those disciplines. So it is an uncanny coincidence that in parallel to this symposium that I and Steve Kellman, together with Ilan Stavans, have been organizing, there was a European Symposium of Translingual Literature doing exactly the same thing that just happened and that we attended in Uppsala in Sweden. And so we are working on some transatlantic collaborations, which I'm sure we will see the results, especially in the coming special issue of another journal that Steve and I will be guest editing and studies in the novel, and you will see the call for papers right there on the table. So this is about the dream coming true, about breaking walls, disciplines, languages, genres, about being scholars, writers, all in one. Just a word to walk you through how we will proceed. So we have Doris Sommer as our keynote speaker. And then we have the panel with translingual writers at 12. After Doris delivers her talk, sometime around by 11:40 or 45, we will have a short break. At 12, we will have the panel with translingual writers, which will be moderated by Steve Kellman. And we will hear those writers themselves read from their work, and Steve will moderate the discussion, which I think is the key point of that event. And then from 1:30 to 3:30, we have lunch. There will be some lunch for participants organized right here, but there are also on the program, you can see a list of places where everybody else or however you decide to organize this can go. Then we will have to resume at 3 o'clock, and the afternoon sessions were organized, were conceived as scholarly discussions, as dialogues between scholars. Of course, we welcome guests to these dialogues, not presentations, but real conversations between disciplines about the topics and the questions related to translingual literature, which is in itself a multidisciplinary and multilingual topic. So, as you can see on your programs, we have a variety of fascinating questions, which will be facilitated by several facilitators coming again from different disciplines. And we have only one break. I hope we can handle that. At 5 o'clock for 15 minutes. And then we have another series of 4 roundtables. So that's the plan for the day. It's a long day, but hopefully it will be an exciting day. And it will be great to meet some people who we haven't met yet, although I will say that we are becoming a very cohesive community. Okay.
Well, I want to very briefly add my welcome to everyone and my gratitude for all of the participants showing up, and my gratitude to Ilan and Amherst College for their wonderful hospitality. Translingual literature, which is literature written by authors in a language other than their first language or in more than one language, is a very vibrant phenomenon at the present moment, but it has a long and rich heritage, as I think most of us are quite aware. It goes at least as far back as various imperial civilizations. Latin literature would not exist without the contributions of people like Apuleius and Seneca, for whom Latin was not the first language. That also applies to imperial languages such as Persian, Chinese, Arabic, Russian, various other transnational languages. It could be argued that translingual literature is the earliest literature, if in fact the alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians and they spread it throughout the Mediterranean. It could be that the various peoples along the Mediterranean coasts took up that alphabet and began writing at least invoices to the Phoenician traders in the Phoenician language. Study of translingualism in the past couple of decades has gained great momentum. Many of you in this room are part of that. I should call attention to a project that Natasha and I recently completed, which was a special issue of Claire Crouch's journal, L2 Journal, devoted entirely to translingual literature. And we compiled a bibliography of primary and secondary works on translingualism, a provisional bibliography because the field is burgeoning. But I would recommend that you take a look at that bibliography if you want to get a sense of the dimensions of the field. Another project that we're working on at the moment is a special issue of the journal Studies in the Novel. And we welcome any contributions any of you might want to make related to translingual writing by novelists in any combination of languages at any period in literary history. Our deadline is December 1st, and you can, well, we have a call for papers right out in the lobby. You can check out the website of Studies in the Novel for further details. So I will turn things back over to Natasha, and we'll start our formal proceedings.
Yes. Thank you, Steve. So it's a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Doris Sommer. Doris Sommer is the Director of Cultural Agents Initiative at Harvard University and is Ira and Jewel Williams Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and African American Studies. Her academic and outreach work promotes development through the arts and humanities, specifically through pretexts in Boston public schools, throughout Latin America and beyond. Pretext is an arts-based training program for teachers of literacy, critical thinking, and citizenship. Among her books are Foundational Fictions, The National Romances of Latin America, which is about novels that help to consolidate new republics. Proceed with Caution with Engaged Minority Literature on the Rhetoric of Particularism, and Bilingual Aesthetics, A New Sentimental Education, and the last but not the least, The Work of Art in the World, Civic Agency and Public Humanities. We have a couple of books by Doris Sommer right there for us to buy and sign. Sommer has enjoyed and is dedicated to developing good public school education. She has a BA from New Jersey's Douglas College for Women and a PhD from Rutgers State University. So let's welcome Doris Sommer.
Thank you so much to all of you, to Ilan, to Natasha, to Steve. It's an honor, a great honor to be here, a great pleasure to come home to Amherst. I spent some of my best years here, and I'm happy to still have friends here, and I enjoy coming back with any pretext. That's one of my favorite words now. I want to show you a couple of clips. That's why we have this screen on. But first, I want to tell you that a colleague years ago told me a poignant story about her granddaughter who came to visit and said she really felt sorry for her friend Raquel. What's wrong with Raquel? Said her grandmother. She said, well, Raquel has only one mother. You know, her grandchild was from a divorced family, had two mothers, would shuttle from one place to another, would travel constantly, and found her life interesting and fulfilling. And poor Raquel had only one mother. All right, so I think that puts me in the mood for talking about this lovely title for your conference, the Stepmother tongue. What does a mother tongue assume? Does it assume a kind of a natural, seamless attachment? One of my doctor friends says that the best way, she's a shrink, she says the best way to deal with family is to treat them as strangers. And I think that that's really good advice, at least it's worked for me. So the idea of a mother as being natural is somehow a trap because we don't allow the margin of unknowability, of respect, of unpredictability, of surprise and distance that a stepmother would necessitate. Right? So to think about our relationship to language as always a relationship of stepmothering, of the artifice of intimacy, I think is not only a healthy but a philosophically appropriate way of thinking about language. Language is artifice. Language is not natural. I mean, Paul de Man would call language an allegory, but there are lots of people who called language lots of things, but not natural. Once we fill in the distance between the word and the thing, we run the risk of very unhappy political consequences, namely fascism. I'll just give you one instantiation of this worry. And I want to talk about really popular elements of this theme of multilingualism, but also elements of aesthetic philosophy. So here's one instantiation from aesthetics. You may remember Walter Benjamin's essay on allegory and Trauerspiel, right, where he distinguishes between symbol and allegory. He is writing in response to what he calls lazy fascist philosophers. Why are they lazy? Because they want to imagine that the thing is the name itself. That when you say sun, you mean everything in an immediate and uninterpretable way. That the truth is the truth, power is power, the sun is the sun, everything you say can have this symbolic immediate meaning. And the meaning is fixed. The meaning is not flexible. In fact, it's so fixed it's brittle, and that's why you have to defend it at any cost. So that's where he says symbol has devolved in fascist aesthetics. It didn't have to be this closed, full, rhetorical device, but it's become that. Symbol in classical literature is always a piece of a meaning, something that needs to be completed, something that sends you on a journey. But in fascist, lazy philosophy, it became the thing itself. On the other side of symbol, Benjamin proposes allegory. What does he mean by allegory? He does not mean the two clean parallel lines that never meet but only refer to one another over a vacuum. He does not mean an allegory such as God is the shepherd, and so the community is the sheep, and mercy is giving pasture, or you can fill in the dots in that kind of parallel. Benjamin preferred a kind of allegory which always happens in time. Because these are extended metaphors, they always revolve in time as opposed to fascist symbol, which is immediate and stops time. Benjamin preferred what he called a Baroque allegory, and he took this from the Spanish Baroque, from Calderon especially, where you have a zigzag. He still called it a dialectic, we can call it a zigzag, where one line of the allegory affects the other one. When something happens in history, it makes a difference in abstract thinking. That abstract concept makes a difference in the way we live history. And that way of living history will again affect our thinking. Okay? So he's talking about the mutual imbrication of what we do and what we say, how we think and how we affect each other. And it's that slippery movement between one and another, that kind of unpredictable movement, that I think we need to revive if we want to appreciate some of the arts that bilingualism and multilingualism offer to us. There's this slippage which is both scary and productive, right? And that's the way life happens. Unfortunately for Benjamin, the movement always went down. You know, he was living in hard times, and he knew things were going to end badly. But they don't always have to end badly, and that's why I wrote Foundational Fictions. There was this ambition to bring the zigzag in an upward movement towards the future. But what I want to say is that the nature of language, because it's got this unfixed core, allows us to be risk-taking, accept the shame of getting something wrong, and continue to experiment with meaning, knowing that our experiments affect other people and they're not fixed. So this notion of artifice, I want to come back to, but first, and I'll want to talk about language as art, language as artifice, and make a reference to Viktor Shklovsky and that whole Russian formalist tradition that is so precious, and we need to keep that in focus too. But first I want to say something about the fate of the studies of bilingualism in the United States. I don't know if this is true in Europe, but just before we started the formal part of this meeting, we had an informal conversation, Gustavo Perez-Frimat and I, about how we've been saying the same things about bilingualism, at least for the last 15 years in our memory, probably for the last 50 years if we had a longer life and a longer memory. And somehow the first move never gets to the second, never gets to the third. We're always repeating the theme that bilingualism is good for us, that bilingualism is interesting, that bilingualism allows us to be creative, that that's the way people live anyway. And somehow that's always news. We say it and we forget it. We say it and we forget it. There's no zigzag, right? Right? I mean, how many times have you read as a news item, bilingualism is good for delaying Alzheimer's. Bilingualism is good for developing democracy. Bilingualism is good for this, bilingualism is good for that. There's a very recent article yesterday in the Harvard Gazette, and the title is Bilingualism as a Life Experience: What We're Learning About the Lasting Cognitive Effects of Speaking Two or More Languages. And what we're learning is exactly what we knew 15 or 20 years ago, that it's good for executive function, I'm just going down, that it's good against aging in the brain, who's bilingual, i.e., most of the world. Language diversity in school would be a good idea, and then there are additional resources. Is any of this new for us? Why isn't it taking? Why do we still have an official culture and a popular culture that denigrates bilingualism and imagines that it's normal to be monolingual and at least more efficient. And again, I want to sound a worried note about efficiency, and this allows me to go back to Shklovsky. All right? Shklovsky, you may remember, responded to a few mentors. He was 24 years old when he wrote Art as Technique or Art as Artifice, or however. You'll tell me how it goes in Russian. What's the... And how would you translate it? Device. Okay, good. And I like the translation in Spanish because it's arte como artificio, right? Which is a redundancy, and you say duh, you know, like it's artificial, and that's good. That's good. So one of the targets, mentors and targets that he has here is this whole Spencerian notion that art is efficient, that it gets the image right, that it's a silver bullet, that it gets to the point immediately. And Freud was very influenced by this too. You know, Freud enjoyed this notion of cutting to the quick, getting to the joke, making a very complicated thing visible and palpable in an immediate way that then you had to reflect on. Okay? So this is a Spencerian approach to communication and a kind of allergy against the delayed effect of some uses of language. Shklovsky says get over the allergy. If language isn't difficult, if it doesn't stop you, if it doesn't detain you, if it doesn't make you ponder, it's not working. Certainly not working as art. But I think we can say in general, because art is device, language is device, language is artificial, language is allegorical, that if language doesn't make you stop and worry that you didn't get it, and know that it's difficult, and ask people what they might mean, then it's not working. If you think that communication is clear, you may be going down some slippery slope of imagining, projecting, speaking for other people. Okay, so it's supremely undemocratic to think you understand what's going on. You have to stop and ask. So that's one way of thinking about language as always unfamiliar and defamiliarizing on purpose the way that we speak. So to think about Shklovsky's idea of defamiliarization as the natural condition of language, I think is aesthetically and politically a good road to go on. And when he says that language is difficult and unfamiliar, especially when it's poetic language, he immediately makes a reference to Aristotle and says, foreign words are always interesting in a speech. And then he has a long excursus on how Russian literature works, always with foreign words, always with that delicious morsel of words that you think you know, or you think you should know because you need to read more, or you think you want to talk to somebody else because maybe they know that word, or they know that reference. And so he talks about the necessity of roughening up language, not making it smooth. And this is a Wittgensteinian point too. You don't want language to be smooth. You need it to have traction. If it doesn't have traction, it doesn't stop you, it doesn't engage you. Right? So you roughen it up. And then he has this reference to Pushkin. He says, why does Pushkin roughen up poetry during his moment? Not because he made it more difficult or had longer lines, but precisely because he made it more popular. And he surprised the reader, he surprised the listener with a popular tone. So there's no formula for roughening, for stopping, for surprising, for showing that language is always a stepmother. But there is an opportunity to rethink what sounds reasonable, what sounds clear, what sounds easy, and then go after it and roughen it up, make it strange. There's no better way of making things strange, says Shklovsky, and we can, I think, provide a chorus than sprinkling foreign words, a foreign grammar construction, a language that wasn't anticipated in that paragraph. Here's a little excursus on Shklovsky. He's writing in 1917. I'm interested in not so much, not that I'm not interested, but I'm ignorant of Russian vanguards. I'm starting to learn something about Latin American vanguards. They're very complicated because the Latin American vanguards that also wanted to break language up, roughen it up, surprise the reader. Latin American vanguards have this ambition of being international, right? That's what the vanguard is. But think about all the vanguard movements. They're all really national. They're all really intimate. They're all about starting off in somebody's living room in an Athenaeum and then rippling out. Latin American vanguards, and here I'm referring to work by Alberto Blasi, by Jorge Schwartz, by standard and very good theorists of the vanguard. Latin American vanguards had to catch up and outdo the First World, and this is where I think we have some brotherhood with East European writers. You had to not only catch up with the First World, you had to outdo it, otherwise what good were you? Right? You didn't have to be as good as the French, you had to be better than the French, otherwise why would anybody read you, even at home, let alone the French? And how did you outdo the First World? How did the Latin American vanguards, and here Shklovsky's giving me an idea of what happened in Russia too, with roughening up language and making it international. The way you roughened it up in Latin America was to add an indigenous word here, was to add an African rhythm there, was to do something that would have been unthinkable in France. If you remember the prologue that Carpentier has to The Kingdom of This World, he basically writes a manifesto for Latin American, what will be the Latin American boom. Everybody quoted him, who wrote 20 years before the boom. But he says there that poor French surrealists, they keep trying to make up strange things. They'll paint you a shoe with toes at the bottom, umbrellas that do funny things. They try hard to be strange. We don't have to try hard. He says anybody in Cuba, anybody in the Caribbean lives in more than one register. We're Catholic and we're Santeros. We're European and we're American. We're white and we're black. We're constantly living in more than one register and getting those registers to wrestle with each other constantly, and we're making each other up at every corner. Look at this architecture, he says. This is, somebody from the outside might think this is a mess. I think this is a buffet, right? He says we're constantly making each other up because the elements are colliding and we have to be creative with it. So there's a way of seeing very elite literature, vanguard literature, as playing with the elements of a denigrated language, of an excluded language, as a way of saving the honor and the sophistication of an elite experiment with language. So here are some other examples that, of course, all of you know. Why did Kafka refresh German? Because it wasn't his language. He thought in Yiddish or Czechoslovakian. His Hebrew probably wasn't as good as his German, but it wasn't much worse. And what's fascinating to me is that when his diaries were finally published about 10 or 12 years ago, right? All the footnotes that were written in Yiddish were excluded. Mm. They're not relevant. It wasn't German. Right? So we wipe out all of the fuel that's making his German so strange, as if it's not relevant. Again, these are habits of thought. We think in national linguistic fetters. You also know that some of the most prestigious recent prizes for literature in France go to Maghrebi writers. I just wrote down a couple of names, all right? Prix Goncourt, 2008, Atik Rahimi. Might not be from Central Paris for 12 generations, right? 2009, Marine Daye. 2010, Michael Hulbeck. That may be Northern, huh? No. Okay, but 2011, Alexis Dieny. Okay, and the prizes that go to Turkish origin writers in Germany are also, I think, notorious and very interesting. There's a 2005 book called The Turkish Turn in Contemporary German Literature. There's something about writing in an adopted language, in a stepmother language, that roughens, that freshens, and we know this, but what I want to say is that it's in the public eye, and we're not taking this seriously as an incentive to teach differently, not only at the university level, at the college level, but also at the primary school level, at the kindergarten level. Let me say something about the relationship between this kind of roughening and democracy. Okay, just a general kind of grounding. And Natasha was kind enough to mention my passion now for a program of teacher training along these lines, because we are so privileged to be in this building, to be in this college, to come from the universities we come from. What are we doing in a world where we know that levels of literacy are indicators for development, social, economic, psychosocial, every kind of development? We all know how to read and write in more than one language. What are we doing about a world that is entirely unequal? The Boston-Cambridge area has more than 35 institutions of higher education. Think about that. You know, that Boston-Cambridge area doesn't have more than 3 million people as a full population. Kids in the 4th grade don't know how to read. Public school kids are failing. There are so many schools in receivership in that area that it shames me every time I walk down the street. So part of what I want to say here is kind of to recruit you to, let's go out into public schools and do something. I'm proud to be a public school girl. Public schools don't work as well as they used to, and we can do something about it. So here's why multilingualism, bilingualism, teaching language in creative ways matters for democracy. Think about when democracy as a modern concept develops. Late 18th century, yeah. Think about when modern aesthetics develops. Late 18th century, they couldn't develop without each other. Why? Because democracy depends on free judgment, doesn't it? Before democracy, did you need to have free judgment, or did you just take orders? Talk to me. If you have a king and a strong church, do you need judgment? No. Okay? But Kant is saying, if you want to be enlightened, if you want to think about another kind of political system, you need to recover, you need to work this innate faculty called judgment, and we have let it atrophy. So how do we access judgment? Can you be free and judge if you have economic interest? No, you just want to maximize. Can you be free and judge if you want to be moral? No, you already know what it is to be good. Can you have economic interest if you're measuring what you're judging against existing concepts? Are you free, or do you also already know what this should look like? You're not free. And if you have a desire for something, and you go out and look for it, are you judging if something is good or bad, or do you already know that you like it? So in none of those cases, economic, moral, conceptual, and satisfaction, are you free. Where's the only place, says Kant, who's not interested in art, where's the only place that you are excited enough to think about something and totally free of interests? You already know because you know that he wrote on aesthetic judgment. It's the only place you are excited enough to stay with something and not already sold out. When you see, and he, as I said, he wasn't an art lover, so he talked more about nature than art. He says, when you see a rose, is it going to make you rich? Is it going to make you good? No. Does it teach you something more if you just enjoy that rose? No. Were you looking for the rose as something that you need to bring home to somebody? No, you just saw it and it surprised you. Then you know that you had something beautiful, and it's the surprise element, it's the shock, it's the pleasant disturbance in your life that you judge as beautiful. If it didn't surprise you, if it weren't a rough moment, if you weren't confused, you wouldn't have anything to judge. You would already know it or want it. So it's those rough moments that allow you to judge. It's those moments in our discourse here of tension between languages, of incomprehension, of doubt, of getting something wrong, of risking something when you know that it might fail you. It's those moments that allow you an aesthetic moment. Now, the aesthetic moment is important not only because it allows you to judge, but because it's free, Kant says. Chances are that someone else will have that same aesthetic response, that same judgment, that this thing was beautiful, or not. And so Hannah Arendt's reading of Kant goes very quickly into the political. She says, it's because you have to test your judgment with someone else's judgment that you immediately elbow the guy next to you and say, what do you think? And so the subjective response to the world becomes an intersubjective response. And if you get enough intersubjective responses going, he calls that common sense. He recoins the word common, the term common sense. And that is the basis of a free sociability. Okay, and it becomes objective after a while. Without that aesthetic move that is triggered by incomprehension and delight, we don't have the free sociability that a democracy needs. So that's one way of thinking about the conflict of codes that allows us to talk to each other, to check out each other's response to something, to ask each other, to be alive to someone else's judgment. And so these bi- and multilingual moments in literature and in our everyday lives are spurs to that kind of dynamic that Kant is laying out and that Arendt spells out. Another way of thinking about the everydayness of this aesthetic stimulus is through Schiller. Schiller, probably Kant's most popular disciple, said in a book called The Aesthetic Education of Man, right? Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. He said, this is a Kantian book, but Kant isn't enough, so I'm going to write these letters. Why isn't Kant enough? Schiller was writing in 1794. Kant wrote his Aesthetics in 1790. The French Revolution had already popped, but by 1794 it was bloody. Schiller sat down to write those letters the day that he found out that the Jacobins had cut off the king's head. And he says to himself, there's so many ways to get rid of a king. Did they have to do that? And they kept cutting heads left and right, because anything that was not in accordance with reason did not fit in the New Republic. And Kant, of course, wrote his book on aesthetics because reason was running over us like a tractor, the arrogance of reason. Judgment comes to detain the arrogance of reason. So Schiller writes this book on aesthetic education to say judgment is not only important when we step back to see what each other's response is to the world, but because we're always engaged in the world. You can't be in a moment when the French Revolution is going on and not know that you have some kind of role in the world. You're watching, you're talking, you're complicit in some way on one side or another. You're doing something. And he's a poet. He's a playwright and a poet. He's a maker. He's not just a Weltbetrachter. You know, he's not just on the outside. So he writes in a way that absolutely democratizes this aesthetic dynamic, not only in the reception, but in the production. He says, we are not only watching a civil war, we are potentially little civil wars in ourselves, because we have this drive towards reason, which the French think is the only really human drive. But let's face it, we have another drive towards passion, sensuality. We're flesh and blood, we're animals, right? So we're always civil wars in ourselves. Think of any morality play, that's what it's about, medieval morality play. What saves us from imploding or exploding? He says the good news is that along with the reason drive and the passion drive, we have a play drive. He literally coins this term, the Spieltrieb. We have a Spieltrieb, and that's what allows us to enjoy a conflict, because we take it as an incentive to pull out a new form. Artists aren't afraid of conflict. Artists say, let me see what I can do. Other people try to tamp it down, try to say, get it right, make a choice, speak this language or that language, get in order. But a bilingual, a multilingual, and a real democratic spirit, whether they're monolingual or not, says, I like the tension. I didn't get it. Let me try something here. Because it's this dynamic of trial and error that allows the world to progress. And the last word I want to say, because I'm much more interested in having a conversation with you, the last word I want to say is that Schiller continued this line of thinking in a couple of subsequent essays, and the one I like a lot is called Naive and Sentimental. I don't know if you remember this essay, right? Where he says, you know, let's call naive poetry the poetry that's an extension of nature. And nature is beautiful. So naive poetry is like what the Greeks did, both in literature and in sculpture. They extended nature. And since we love nature, we love that art. Look at this Greek statue, it's still beautiful. Look at this Greek play, it's still beautiful, right? How much freedom do you have when you're extending nature? Huh? How free can you be if you are on a track that's already set? So he associates Goethe with that kind of naive production of literature, right? Goethe is a child of nature. He's a genius. Everything he does is fabulous. He can write long poems and not correct himself. It's a phenomenon. He says, but poor Goethe, he's not free. He's on a track. Me, I'm free. I make mistakes all the time. Look at all these crossings out. Look at these crumpled papers. I sweat. I don't sleep. I struggle. And because I make so many mistakes, I know I'm free. It's only because I'm capable of failing that I know I'm exercising the Spieltrieb. I know I'm living the tensions. I know I can get it one way or another way, and I try things out to see what will work. And maybe it won't. But the ephemeral quality of connection, of art, is what he is celebrating in the aesthetic education and in the essays that follow. It's delicate, it's unstable, and it's also ephemeral. We have to keep working at it. We have to keep sweating. We have to keep asking each other. We have to keep taking each other's temperature and understanding that the difficulty itself is the pleasure of literature. We don't have to get it all down, but we have to be alive to the stimulant and appreciate, admire people who know things that we don't know, i.e. other languages? How many people do you know who read novels and imagine they have to translate all the foreign words that are sprinkled there? Right? We used to read like that. Now I say, oh, that's a signal to remind me that I'm not identified with the character or with the author. That's interesting. That's foreign. Here's a little come hither, stay thither routine that I'm beginning to enjoy as a modern living in a multicultural world. I can't identify with anyone. And if I did, I would be projecting, speaking for other people, and going down a political path that is not really democratic. So I'm going to end there. And really invite a conversation with me, with each other. I'm very happy to be in this group, and want to hear you. Oh, I didn't show both of them. I can send it to you. Yeah.
That's just thank you so much for your keynote this morning. It's great to hear you speak about a number of projects you've been passionate about. I'd like to maybe bring the notion of translation to your point about tension. Tom Connolly talks about translation as an art where we ultimately seek to find co-equals with the original. And my thinking about translation tension has to do with the following. I think that in translating, we constantly battle betrayal, enrichment, and suspension. And I wonder what you think about that. So whenever you translate a text from one language to another, or from one language to many other languages, it seems to invite us to betray the original, to enrich it, or maybe suspend it at the same time. I wonder if you might think about that.
I think there's been a lot of attention to translation. I think that there are always, these two poles of betraying and staying close to the text. And everything I've seen in translation studies places itself or toggles between these poles. What I like about veering off into a conversation on bilingual and multilingual performances is that it respects the margin of incomprehensibility in the original text. Translation studies imagines that we readers operate in one language or another. And so the text has to come to us in some way, rough or smooth. That's the debate around translation studies. But to refocus this notion of multilingualism into a question of the simultaneity of languages rather than the toggling, I think is where I want to focus. I don't have more to say about translation than has been said in a small industry of translation studies.
I'd like to raise the question of the contradiction of Schiller writing that in 1794. Friedrich Schiller, writing this Ästhetische Erzählung is mentioned in 1794, but it was not beneath his dignity to accept from the French Revolutionary Committee the French citizenship that they bestowed upon him. So you see a contradiction between, on the one hand, Schiller saying that I feel free because I make mistakes, etc., outside of reason, and yet accepting a citizenship, a French citizenship, based on la raison suprême, etc., etc. And whether there is not a contradiction even in social class. I mean, it is the bourgeois who cut off the heads of the aristocrats. Generally, it was the aristocrats who had the leisure of finding pleasure in multiple languages and who were the cosmopolitan and multilinguals of the time. And Goethe knew many different languages. So the distinction between Goethe and Schiller is almost a social class distinction between the aristocrat at the Hof in Weimar, etc., and the bourgeois kind of Schiller, even though he had the particle to his name. So can you explain a little bit about the contradiction in Schiller between flirting with the powers that be, but on the other hand, revolting against them?
Yeah. When was he granted citizenship? What year?
I think 1792 or 93, yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, until 1794, part of that movement, part of that bourgeois French revolutionary movement. He was a citoyen. He was proud of that. But at that moment, a year later, or a year and a half later, his heart was broken. And the passages in the letters where he goes after both the masses and the aristocrats. I mean, he's still taking a kind of a progressive bourgeois position between them. But he says, between the savagery of sensuality and the barbarism of reason, right? There's no ethical difference. There's just a different style. They're both abominable. He said, first he goes after the masses and talks about savagery, but then he says much worse are the aristocrats who are barbarous because they have the leisure to be barbarous. You know, when Benjamin says that the history of civilization is the history of barbarism, remember that? That's a famous quote. We all think that that's such an interesting paradox. It's not a paradox if you figure that he's been reading Schiller. The name for barbarism in Schiller is reason run wild. That's what it is. It's cutting off people's heads in the name of reason. So I appreciate this contradiction. He was pained by that contradiction, and that's why he sat down to write this book. I think it was kind of an expiation for his enthusiasm. And the other thing that I want to say is that there are contradictions in people's lives. I wouldn't want to get autobiographical about this. There are contradictions in people's lives that could undermine their intellectual contributions, because we're all, you know, bundles of contradictions. Here I am talking about our responsibility to public schools coming from Harvard University and having been at Amherst College, right? But I want to take responsibility for my contradiction. And if I didn't want to, I could just go home and, you know, and work less. But we're all bundles of contradictions, and I don't want to miss the intellectual contribution because of the biographical mess that we all get ourselves into. I mean, how many people dismiss Kant because underneath it all he was a racist? Ooh, what he said about, you know, the Indian Sachem who liked restaurants more than monuments, or, you know, the blacks who are this or that, you know, like, they just dismiss Kant. And I want to save what we can save from good teachers, even if they don't live up to what they say.
So I want to, Doris, I love the way you presented your talk, and want to catch another contradiction and celebrate contradiction in the Whitman way. You started with the thought that over the last 15 years or 20 years we've been talking about bilingualism and multilingualism, and we're caught not advancing and repeating the same things. But it seems to me that you and I and many others are caught in a romantic way of looking at bilingualism and multilingualism. If 4 out of 5 people in the world are bilingual, we're celebrating bilingualism as the way to be democratic, the way to be a citizen. But the world is falling apart, and empires have collapsed because of bilingualism or because of multilingualism, Not because of language, but language was part of that environment, and language was not able to bring people to coalesce together. In fact, it fractured those empires or smaller entities like the Balkans. So whereas we look in the United States into this nostalgic view that having 2 or more languages will help our kids in public schools, the fact is that in places where 2 or more languages in public schools are taught are not more peaceful or more democratic than we want us to be. And I see the contradiction here because I am myself guilty of dreaming in that way, because all autobiography is ideology and vice versa. And because also the very nature of our country is that we, within these 4 walls, have to be fighting against the vision of limiting language that reduces us to being monolithic, monolingual, monocultural. But multilingual, multicultural doesn't necessarily lead to a more stable, more peaceful, more rational, and more democratic world.
That's true. That's true. I think that every intervention is in a context. And I wouldn't presume to know what kind of intervention to make in another context. I can feel the iron cage of monolingualism in this context. So my intervention is local. Now, local in a kind of multiplied way, because when you say that multilingualism was an explosive feature in the Balkans, one example that you remind me of is Yugoslavia, that decided after a bloody civil war to distinguish between one language and another when they really weren't all that different. So the distinction was imposed as a political knife. Think about Urdu and Hindi, right? I mean, people who speak Urdu and people who speak Hindi speak the same language, they write it differently. But the difference is imposed. So because I think we identify political allegiances with languages, languages become a sword for political distinctions. Now, I don't live in those situations. I wouldn't know how to intervene there. But I think that we would do well to inquire with local intellectuals and artists about how they're intervening. Here, I think, still, the Latino students at Harvard are still from educational backgrounds where they were told not to speak Spanish. Okay? The indigenous students in Latin America, whom I meet, are equally told not to speak a home language. And we know that Quechua speakers in Washington, D.C., who had to learn some Spanish, learn English much faster than the fancy Creoles who only speak Spanish, right? We know that this is an advantage, and yet kids are continually told not to keep a home language. One of the things that we like to do with pretexts, let me just tell you one word about pretext, just to talk about the immediate context. We teach teachers to stop worrying about knowing everything, right? Because they should just be facilitators in a classroom. So with pretexts, any text, any academic text, whether it's literature or history or physics, doesn't matter, becomes an excuse for making art. And since kids don't like to read, we start by reading out loud while kids are making things. So we recreate a tobacco factory, right? We recreate a tobacco factory. Any Cuban scholar, any Puerto Rican, Dominican, and New York, people with deep New York backgrounds know what tobacco factories look like. By the way, do you know what Samuel Gompers did to earn a living? I mean, he was a union organizer when he was making trouble, but how did he earn a living? This is the grandfather of the AFL-CIO. No, but he rolled tobacco. He hired readers. He rolled tobacco, and the first labor union in the United States is the United Cigar Workers Union. So cigar working was the place where everyone was an intellectual. Whether they knew how to read or not, everybody heard important texts, talked about them in the afternoon, and so we start like that. And so if kids don't know how to read, and if their parents know very little English or Spanish or whatever language we're targeting, they can still hear. So we read a text, and then everybody asks a question about the text, and we continue to make a choreography of it, or a photo shoot, or a mural, or whatever. And to talk about your artwork afterwards means that you're interpreting at a good level, okay? So I want to say that general shape of pretexts, to say that one of the activities is grandmother tells a story. What does that mean? The kids go home with their physics lesson, with their history chapter, with their literary piece, and tell the grandmother what they learned in school. And ask the grandmother, grandmother, it could be an uncle, it could be somebody who doesn't speak the target language, somebody who speaks another language, asks for something in return, a story, a lesson, a history, whatever. And then the kid has to come to school and display that offering on the clothesline. We borrowed that from Brazil, publishing on a clothesline, literatura de cordel. Everybody displays on a clothesline. So if you don't have a relative who speaks another language who can offer you something that nobody else has, you feel really left out. Okay? So there are ways of making visible the advantages, the depth, the range, the difference that we can access. And that's the kind of intervention that I can think of locally here. And you're absolutely right that I wouldn't imagine intervening in some place where I couldn't feel the iron cage. Yeah.
It was interesting about the whole question of mistakes and stuff. It's just one of Beckett's last works was called Worst Word Ho. And it was the idea, you can only go towards the worst because the worst itself has a lack of emptiness, has a lack of want. So I mean, it was, and actually, it was one of the ones he didn't translate, which ultimately was translated very well. There's Capopia, but regarding something else in here, I'm sort of picking up on what Ilan says. It's Borges says somewhere every intellectual argument is ultimately between Plato and Aristotle. And today Plato is very bad, very bad press. I mean, essentialism, horrible, But the thing is, you still have the word mother and stepmother. I mean, it's sort of like, what is a mother? Is mother because you see a whole bunch of people who say that they're mothers and then you figure out what the mother is, or is there some kind of, essential notion of what a mother is, from which you could then say, well, a stepmother can be, as good as a mother, or even better than a mother. But the thing is, you need to have some notion of the self in order to, it's like the whole idea of somebody, Jean Raspail, who's not a very good person in this room, no doubt, called Big Other. It's sort of like, but there is, you couldn't have the other if you didn't have the self. So this is the thing. It's the other is the only thing nowadays that's celebrated, and it's problematic to say the least.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and I love your reference to Beckett. Another one that is very popular among artists in English language comes from Endgame, right? Try again, fail better, right? Everybody knows that as a slogan. They don't even know that it's from Beckett, but it's along the same lines. And you're right to say that stepmother already assumes a concept mother, and it assumes that it's a second, right? Because if it's a stepmother, you had a natural mother, and there would be no charm of the stepmother if there weren't a natural mother. John Dewey says something very similar. He says, you teach by getting kids to make things, right? To be creative. And John Dewey has very few footnotes, but Schiller is one of his constant footnotes. He's very much in the line of Schiller. And he says, of course you can't break a system. You can't use your Spieltrieb if you don't have systems that already exist. You can't make an intervention if there isn't, a system or an institution. So bilingualism is a lovely concept because it assumes not just the other, but the other already assumes the one. The tension is already there, and I don't want to lose that. When you bring up a very good caution here. People who are worried about immigration, worried about multilingualism, think that immigrants are not going to learn English, right? That they'll just stay with Spanish or Chinese or whatever it is that they're speaking. You know, we can't have a lot of bilingual people here. They're not going to learn English. It's like Donald Trump speaking, right? So the idea is always the more than one, always the more than one, and I'm glad that you underline that. Yeah.
Doris, could we take this back to the concept of bilingualism, which you just called lovely? My name is Aneta Pavlenka. I'm not a literary scholar. I do psycholinguistics of bilingualism, and what I wanted to talk about is that from my perspective, a celebration of bilingualism, which we all engage in, Gustavo called me once a pasionaria of bilingualism, is as dangerous for our society as stigmatization of bilingualism, because on some level it highlights the non-normative status of bilingualism, whether we celebrate or stigmatize. And the efforts by psycholinguists that you named, well, bilingualism is good for you, it gives you cognitive advantage, have been also highly decried in our community because the studies are flawed. Yet they get into the media as part of commodification of bilingualism as something that is good for the society, will solve our problems. It won't. On some level, I think there is an agreement, at least in our community, what we want is not the celebration, we want normalization of bilingualism. And from that perspective, I think it's not our efforts that have been central, but efforts by places like Home Depot and Lowe's that didn't ask us what to do, they just went ahead and put up bilingual signage, making it normal for people to see it. What do you make of this contradiction between celebration, stigmatization, and normalization?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that, again, we have to be strategic. I take your point, and the very first thing that I said is that fixing a meaning is always dangerous, intellectually, politically, emotionally, right? One of my favorite writers on this is Emmanuel Levinas, you know, the philosopher of ethics. In communication, it's always the saying that's more important than the said, right? It's the activity of speaking. So to celebrate something may fix it too hard, right? But it depends on the conversation. I don't know. I would like to have a range of possible responses depending on the interlocutor. Businesses know that bilingualism is good for business. Okay? So they don't have to celebrate. They just say what's good for business. Public schools don't know that it's good for business. They're worried about kids dropping out. They can't read the signs. They can't read the feet. And I think that decision makers in education need us to be addressing them in a different tone than normalization. I'm not sure what the tone is. Maybe we can figure out good strategies. But everything is so context bound. I mean, finally, it's a Wittgensteinian point, but everything is context bound. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on this idea of normalizing bilingualism, multilingualism, and also this phrase of the monolingual cage, and then bring this into the world of education that you've spoken about. I would define the work I do as sort of a critical applied linguistics in public schools, sort of linguistic anthropology, with multilingual, translingual students for whom, they're refugees, they speak varieties of Arabic, they're interacting with students who speak varieties of Spanish, mixed with varieties of African American English, mixed with some attempts at some foothold into standardized white English academic disciplinary discourses. And in these schools and in these hallways, this monolingual cage doesn't necessarily exist for these kids. And the amount of teachers may have some of this monolingual imagined cage that certainly is reinforced through English-only mandates, policies, discourses in the media. But on the ground, in the schools, it really is a bit of a fantasy. And I think it's an interesting place to bring this kind of work, to sort of document how students who are often perceived as not educated, as semi-lingual or something, as really looking at the multilingual resources and how normative it is, not just now, but historically, if you go back to some of the work of people who are sitting in this room. And I think that might be an interesting intersection with what you're talking about in terms of larger conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think you pointed to a difference between normal and normative. The teachers are still in their normative and the kids are in their normal. And how do you get those in sync is part of, I think, part of our horizon. Bilingual education is still illegal in most places in Massachusetts. We have a couple of bilingual schools, but they're outliers.
Can I just have one more question, and then after that, we will break and continue the conversation.
As long as it's been eaten.
Over coffee, okay?
So I've been remembering my friend Luis Iglesias and our trips from between Brandeis and the West, and he gave me this story with which I always start the work on the blue books, on the Wittgenstein blue books. He learned. He was very bilingual. He's a Cuban father and a Quaker mother from Maryland, and he went back and forth between Cuba and the United States in summers. And his cousins in Cuba were fascinated by knowing that he spoke something else. He spoke Spanish with them, he spoke something else, and when he went away, he spoke English over there. And one of his cousins, which is the other side of Wittgenstein, one day sort of asked him, in Spanish, I'm going to translate. The cousin said, I understand that when you go over there, you speak English, you come over here, you speak Spanish, but you're telling me that the people over there don't know any Spanish. And Luis reports says, yeah, they don't know Spanish, just like you don't know English. And the cousin says, but I understand that they speak English among themselves, but what I don't understand is, how do they know what the words mean? So that's one amazing thing, and it's nice that extreme of normalization and the Platonic Aristotelian problems is in there and all that. It's nice that happened from the mouth of a Cuban kid rather than it didn't happen to him here in the United States. That's one thing. And Luis died, and I never like to say rest in peace for Luis, but now I can say rest in play. And I'm going to be saying that for a while. Rest in play. The other thing I wanted to do is just report just what happened to me in class here in the last 2 weeks. I'm doing a new first-year seminar on crossing language and living in translation. And so we do a lot of historical Bible translation history reading, and then I send them away in groups of 5 without me to read their favorite or what they know. It's one passage, and I keep it narrative, but in 10 or 12 translations. They really have to, and they have to work with each other. So each group, I have the papers are very, I keep it very personal. Tell me what you learn. They are atheistic, non-readers, atheistic readers of the Bible, very religious readers, very religious non-readers. They're all there. Just because they have to talk to each other with a multiplicity of translations, and just because they're all, the coin of humility is their lack of access to the Hebrew. and to the Greek. Actually, there are a few that do Greek and Latin, which is kind of interesting. But that kind of lack of access to the original and having to resort to a multiplicity of versions, focus, emphasis, is totally destabilizing the authorial or the authority linkage. It's been really magic. It's been really magic. And they come back. I didn't know about this. I mean, I didn't plan it to happen like this. But the play aspect, what they talk most about is the surprise about having to hear from each other and to hear the translation that the other one looked at. And it is just an amazingly peacemaking, destabilizing, and I want to call it a tactic rather than a strategy. Yeah, I get my deserto nailed into me deeply, but it's such a hopeful thing. I didn't give him homework for the vacation, but I told him to go and tell the family, they're going back home, tell their family about this funny thing, and I think they will rest in play also.
Thank you.